What is the future of the union movement in the era of a globalised market liberal economy? That was the other topic, the one I chose as opposed to the one I rejected. And that's what I want to talk about today. And if one is of a left-wing persuasion, as I am, there is always a very strong temptation when invited to address a union gathering to pull one's punches in the name of solidarity and boosting the members' morale, rather than tell a union audience the bleak and bitter truth as he or she sees it. The left-winger resorts to the time-worn tactics of heaping scorn and insult upon the union's enemies, reassuring those present that history is on their side, and confidently predicting the day of Jubilee, if not tomorrow or next week, then certainly around the time the next Labour government gets elected. And that, of course, is a lot of fun, and it makes us feel better, but it doesn't really help. When fighting the capitalist enemy, the Italian Marxist theoretician Antonio Gramsci enjoined his followers to display pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, by which I have always taken him to mean: be aware of the nature and the strength of the forces arrayed against your cause, but never let that awareness persuade you that ultimate victory is a chimera, or that the struggles that make victory possible are pointless. My purpose here today, therefore, is to give you my assessment of the nature and strength of what you have called the globalised market liberal economy, or as I prefer to call it, neoliberal totalitarianism, and what that portends for the New Zealand trade union movement. And I want to begin with an anecdote, a story from my personal experience, which I believe neatly encapsulates some of the problems confronting your union particularly. It involves a young jobbing lecturer. I'm not sure if that's the right designation, but I'm sure you've all met the sort of lecturer I mean. She was employed by a northern university on a contract to teach a specified number of classes for a specified number of semesters for a specified salary, which you may be sure was considerably lower than the salaries paid to permanent teaching staff. The lecturer's contract had been renewed annually for the best part of a decade, which, back when I was a union organiser, would have suggested that she was an employee and not an independent contractor, but that is by the by, because it was many, many years ago that I was a union organiser. But at the end of last year, just after the People's Commissar for Higher Education, Comrade Stephen Joyce, had ordered an immediate increase in the output of engineering students, this young lecturer was called before the university's HR department and informed that her contract would not be renewed. Boom, just like that. Dismissed. Jobless. Now, it will come as no surprise to you, I'm sure, to hear that this young lecturer fell under the rubric of the humanities, or that being one of those fortunate enough to have been educated in the liberal arts, her politics veered more towards the left than the right. Naturally, she had been a loyal, dues-paying member of the Tertiary Education Union and its predecessors for as long as she had been lecturing. Now, as you might imagine, when she called me with her bad news and asked if I knew anybody who was hiring liberal arts graduates, my first response was to ask her if she was a member of the union. Of course she was. Well then, I said, she should get the union involved, especially since she had been contracted to the university for so long that I had a fairly strong suspicion she would win any case treating her as an employee. And now we come to the point of what is probably the TEU, a very familiar story. The young lecturer told me flat there was no way she was going to involve the union, that people in her position who called in the union had next to no chance of ever being rehired. Well, why did you join the union? I asked in exasperation. Why on earth have you been paying dues for 10 years? Well, she said rather sheepishly, she believed in belonging to unions, but not apparently to availing herself of their services, I said rather sharply, at which point she sighed and told me that I was out of tune with the times. When I was her age, she said, cutting me to the quick, belonging to a union was compulsory, and the union movement was too strong for the employers to operate an effective blacklist. But times have changed. Bringing in the union was not the act of someone hoping to build a career in academia. HR departments in one university had a nasty habit of talking to HR departments in other universities, and not just in New Zealand. A reputation for being an active trade unionist could follow you, or even worse, precede you all over the world. So no, she would not be calling in the union. Now, if we pick apart this little story, there is a great deal we can learn about the power or lack of power of unions in the 21st century. It has even more to teach us about the power of employers and the alarming degree of influence which they are now able to exercise over the political environment of practically every nation on earth. A degree of influence so powerful that even a person sympathetic to unions, someone who has been paying union fees for 10 years, is not convinced that calling upon her union for support will result in anything other than serious damage to her future career prospects. Consider what the story tells us about the effectiveness of the modern university's reconfiguration of its employment relationships. Look at the advantages they gain from creating a pool of cheap academic labour. Not only do these jobbing lecturers supply them with an extremely flexible, effectively deunionised workforce willing to work for grossly unfair and inadequate wages, but by its very presence, that workforce also serves to depress the wages and maximise the vulnerability of the university's permanent academic employees. Add to this the taylorisation of the academic work process through innovations such as PBRF, and it is clear that the universities have finally become what the student rebels at Berkeley way back in the 1960s accused them of becoming: knowledge factories. My little story also illustrates the vast discrepancies in experience which have opened up between the generations when it comes to perceptions of union effectiveness. For my generation, New Zealand is born in or before the mid-1950s, the trade union was central to the nation's social and economic life. The left may have seen unions as repositories of reassuring strength. The right undoubtedly feared and resented their power, but no sensible person could ignore the fact of their existence. That was because trade unions enjoyed a legal status which guaranteed them recognition. New Zealand boasted an industrial relations system which frankly acknowledged the importance of ordinary working people to the smooth functioning of the economy. The rights won over the course of a century of industrial and political struggle had made workers genuine partners in the processes of production, people whose interests had to be seriously considered, citizens who could not be ignored. The first time I was ever asked to be an emissary for the Otago Trades Council, it was in furtherance of the old Federation of Labour's campaign against the Muldoon government's cuts to social spending. The unionists I was asked to address worked at the Hillside Railway workshops in South Dunedin. I shall never forget being escorted into Hillside's cavernous machine shop, being hoisted up onto a massive metal lathe and introduced to a sea of grimy faces that honestly would not have looked out of place on a Soviet propaganda poster. They were all men. They were all wearing blue overalls with blue collars. They all stood there, feet apart, arms folded, heads up. And I can't remember exactly what I told them, but it seemed to do the trick, because not only did they vote to knock off work for an afternoon so that they could attend the FOL rally in Dunedin's Regent Theatre, but they decided that they were going to march there in good order, 3 miles there, 3 miles back, all 300 men. These days I've been on picket lines and I hear unionists chanting about having the power. What sort of power? Union power. Those Hillside workers would have snorted in derision. You either have the power or you don't. In 1982, the workers at Hillside knew they possessed genuine industrial clout. They didn't need to chant. And in 2012, all the chanting in the world wouldn't have made the slightest difference. Kiwi Rail, with the government's blessing, decided to import its new rolling stock from China. Hillside wasn't permitted to compete. Today, the cavernous machine shop stands empty, and Hillside's workers will never march again. And that was always the mission of neoliberalism, to break the power of organised labour, not simply to address the manifest tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which the existence of powerful unions only exacerbated, but to destroy the confidence which year by year the union-driven policy of maintaining full employment was instilling in ordinary working people. As far back as 1943, the Polish economist Mikhail Kalecki had anticipated what he called the political aspects of full employment. And I quote, "The maintenance of full employment would cause social and political changes which would give a new impetus to the opposition of the business leaders. Indeed, under a regime of permanent full employment, the sack would cease to play its role as a disciplinary measure. The social position of the boss would be undermined, and the self-assurance and class consciousness of the working class would grow. Strikes for wage increases and improvements in conditions of work would create political tension. It is true that profits would be higher under a regime of full employment than they are on the average under laissez-faire, and even the rise in wage rates resulting from the stronger bargaining power of the workers is less likely to reduce profits than to increase prices, and thus adversely affects only the rentier interests. But discipline in the factories and political stability are more appreciated than profits by business leaders. Their class instinct tells them that lasting full employment is unsound from their point of view, and that unemployment is an integral part of the normal capitalist system. The globalized market liberal economy was born out of the efforts of the large American, British, and European corporations to evade the effects of eroding discipline in the factories and rising political instability by relocating their production facilities in countries where discipline and political stability were inscribed on the welcome mat. And this option of relocating their factories to third world and Eastern European dictatorships, Western capitalists had at last discovered a political and economic lever to replace what Kalecki called the state of confidence, quoting once again from his Political Quarterly article of 1943. Under a laissez-faire system, the level of employment depends to a great extent on the so-called state of confidence. If this deteriorates, private investment declines, which results in a fall of output and employment, both directly and through secondary effects on the fall of incomes upon consumption and investment. This gives the capitalists a powerful indirect control over government policy. Everything which may shake the state of confidence must be carefully avoided because it would cause an economic crisis. But once the government learns the trick of increasing employment by its own purchases, this powerful controlling device loses its effectiveness. Hence, budget deficits necessary to carry out government intervention must be regarded as perilous. The social function of the doctrine of sound finance is to make the level of employment dependent on the state of confidence. Any failure by politicians to sufficiently consider the needs of their country's leading capitalists could now be met with the threat of closing down factories in which hundreds, even thousands of voters earned their livelihoods. If those same politicians wanted those factories and jobs to stay put, then they were going to have to guarantee the same level of discipline and stability as any investor-friendly third world dictatorship. In the Western democracies, where the production or the introduction of tanks and armoured vehicles into political and industrial disputes tends to be avoided if at all possible, the disciplining of organised labour was accomplished by the jettisoning of full employment as a goal, which had been the driver of all post-war Western governments' fiscal policies. Keynes's demand management was out, Friedman's anti-inflationary monetary policies were in. Unemployment rocketed, and unions found themselves confronting a labour market no longer geared for sellers, but rigged for buyers. Now, just in case the new realities of Western capitalism were not completely clear to the leaders of organised labour, the newly elected President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, sacked every striking member of the Federal Air Traffic Controllers Union, PATCO, arrested their leaders, and showed them being hauled off to jail in handcuffs on the 6 o'clock news. 2 years later, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher drove home the same message to the British Trade Union Congress by taking on and decisively defeating the militant miners' union. As Bob Dylan wryly noted in his 1983 album Infidel, well, the job that you used to have, they gave it to somebody down in El Salvador. The union's a big business friend and they're going out like a dinosaur. It's sundown on the union and what's made in the USA. Sure was a good idea till greed got in the way. Dylan's quip about unions being big businesses raises yet another painful aspect of organised labour's slow demise, the movement's passivity. Nowhere in the English-speaking world did the peak organisations of the labour movement ever mount a serious campaign of resistance to the so-called free market. In the United States, the AFL-CIO declined to come to the aid of the locked-out air traffic controllers. The TUC in Britain threw money at the National Union of Mine Workers, but little else. In Australia, the ACTU not only didn't fight back against the market liberal tide, it allowed itself to be co-opted into making sure that the economic rationalist policies of Bob Hawke's and Paul Keating's Labour government were implemented without hindrance from the rank and file. Which brings us to what is seen by many on the left as one of the most tragic episodes in the history of the New Zealand labour movement, the NZCTU's 1991 refusal to call a general strike against the Employment Contracts Bill. There isn't time today to go into all the reasons for the debacle of 1991. What I will touch upon, however, given the largely white-collar composition of the TEU, are the class issues evident in the crucial vote of 18th April 1991. When the ECB was introduced at the end of 1990, the membership of the CTU was based mostly in the private sector. Union density among private sector workers stood at or slightly above 50%. It was considerably higher in the public sector. Today, only 1 in every 10 private sector workers belongs to a trade union. Hundreds of thousands of workers in scores of occupations who prior to the ECA enjoyed union protection and received the wages and conditions set down in national awards now do without both. If they want the job on offer, they must opt for the individual contract which the boss pushes across the desk towards them. Take it or leave it. Things might have been different if on the 18th of April 1991 the union leaders representing civil servants, local government officers, teachers, nurses, bank officers and skilled tradespeople had voted in favour of the proposal for a one-day general strike put forward by the Service Workers Federation and supported by just about every other private sector union. But they did not. The proposal was defeated. 190,910 in favour, 250,122 against. By refusing to back the call for a general strike, the CTU guaranteed that every clause of Bill Birch's radically right-wing legislation would enter the statute books without modification. I was told by someone who worked in Birch's office that the minister anticipated having to surrender up to a third of the bill's clauses to reach an acceptable compromise with the trade union movement he believed to be certain to go to the mattresses, as they say in the mafia, against Jim Bolger's government. Because that didn't happen, 90% of private sector workers are now at the mercy of an employer class which for more than 20 years has not been required to improve the way it manages its businesses. Bosses who have, since 1991, been able to restore profitability to their firms simply by taking advantage of legislation which allows them to make their employees work longer and harder for less. The cleaners, clerical workers, shop assistants, rest home workers, overwhelmingly female-dominated occupations, while the focus of today's living wage campaign are the workers who have borne the heaviest burden of the most radical exercise in labour market deregulation undertaken anywhere in the Western world. For many of those workers, trade union membership isn't even a memory. They have never experienced the empowering effects of solidarity and struggle. Instead, they have learned to look after themselves and their families on their own terms. And more of them expect every other New Zealander to do the same. The public sector unions, whose votes cut those private sector workers adrift on the 18th of April 1991, may have thought they were behaving maturely. They may have agreed with the NZCTU's economist, Peter Harris, who later declared that the proposal for a general strike didn't warrant serious analysis. They may even have endorsed Harris's later characterisation of the NZCTU's critics as retrospective militants, pseudo-academics, and armchair revolutionaries. But, but as Dr. Brian Roper, Associate Professor of Political Studies at the University of Otago, wrote in 2007, the militant, academic, and revolutionary critics can justifiably claim that the NZCTU leadership played a conservative and treacherous role in the historically crucial conjuncture of March and April 1991. Wet this throat tonight. I would go further than Brian. My assessment of the behaviour of the public sector unions, representing, as they did, workers who were on the whole better qualified, better paid than the average New Zealander, enjoyed higher social status, and whose participation was absolutely vital to the success of any general strike, is much harsher. I would say that the public sector unions' refusal to stand in solidarity with their brothers and sisters in the private sector, working class people who were desperate for their support against the readily foreseeable effects of the ECA, was not simply immoral and cowardly, it was a strategic blunder for which, in the second decade of the 21st century, they are likely to pay a very heavy price. Because after 30 years of globalised market liberal economy, the world's public sector unions are pretty much the only unbeaten unions left standing, and they are standing in the way. Many of you will be familiar with the famous quotation of the German cleric pastor Martin Niemöller about the moral delinquency of Nazi Germany's Christian leaders. First, they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews. I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for the Catholics, and I did not speak out because I was not a Catholic. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out. Around the world, but particularly in the English-speaking countries, the public sector unions are beginning to feel like Pastor Niemöller. In Canada and the USA, unions representing civil servants, teachers and nurses have been under attack for close to a decade. And in those countries, they have encountered precious few groups in society willing to speak out for them. Many of you here may have followed on the internet the astonished and then the outraged reaction of American public sector unions as Republican Party-dominated state legislatures in Wisconsin, Ohio, and Michigan passed legislation designed to undermine and ultimately destroy the unions of their state employees. The people behind these anti-union measures, billionaires like the Koch brothers, have examined the labour relations environment in the United States and concluded that apart from the union members directly affected, very few people care enough about workers' rights to take any effective political action against their further radical curtailment. To make doubly sure, however, they launched brutally effective propaganda campaigns against what they characterised as the state employers' unreasonable and over-generous pension entitlements. Taxpayers who ultimately funded these workers' pensions were encouraged to contrast their own meagre or non-existent benefit packages with the bloated entitlements of teachers, nurses, and other state employees. Envy is not included among the 7 deadly sins for nothing. It is important, I believe, to understand the sheer mendacity of the forces behind these campaigns. I watched a clip on YouTube recently of a debate between a unionist and the spokesperson for one of these front organisations dedicated to destroying the last vestiges of union power in America. What soon became clear was that the people fronting the anti-union cause represented a new breed of right-wing spokespeople. This fellow's dismissal of the US Budget Office and the US Bureau of Labour Statistics as purveyors of left-wing bias lacking in credibility simply took my breath away. He had instantly made any attempt to argue on the basis of factual data impossible. I mean, this guy was really frightening. The reason he was able to get away with what can only be described as stormtrooper tactics is because of the exhaustive research of the right-wing think tanks, which has reassured them that unions and unionists have very few allies in the wider community. Oh, sure, a majority of Americans may support union rights in principle, just like the young lecturer I introduced you to at the beginning of this talk. But that doesn't mean they're willing to join them or pour out into the streets in their defence. Union density in the United States is 11.4%, half that of New Zealand's. In the private sector, it has fallen to just 7%, the lowest since the Great Depression, and well below American unionism's 1950s high water mark of 33%. In other words, 93% of US private sector workers have developed strategies for personal and familial survival that simply do not include trade unions. They know that unionised workers earn 10 to 30% more than they do, but far from acting as an incentive to join up, this discrepancy is construed by many workers as a form of discrimination. An alarming number of Americans appear to believe that the higher union rates have been set at their expense. Still more Americans take a curious pride in not being a member of a union. Even in the America of 1964, when unions were strong, Roger Miller could go to the top of the charts singing "Third Boxcar Midnight Train, Destination Bangor, Maine, old worn-out suits and shoes. I don't pay no union dues." King of the road. And by the middle of the 1970s, even among the staunchest of the American unions, the United Auto Workers, something important had faded. The conviction, born of the great CIO organising drives of the 1930s, that the unions could take working class Americans to a new and better world, was waning. In Stayin' Alive, the 1970s and the Last Days of the Working Class by Labour historian Jefferson Cowie, you can find recorded the sad soliloquy of Dewey Burton, the quintessential auto worker, whose colourful views had often been canvassed and broadcast by the American television networks. Among the last things that Dewey ever said in public was this: "Something's happening to people like me, working stiffs, as they say. And it isn't just that we have to pay more for this and that, or that we're having to do without this or make do with a little less of that. It's deep and hard to explain. But it's more like more and more of us are sort of leaving all our hopes outside in the rain and coming into the house and just locking the door, you know, just turning the key and click. That's it for what we always thought we could be." I've spent some time describing the labour relations environment in the United States because for so much of New Zealand's post-war history, what happened in America has served as prelude to what later happened here. In politics, especially the USA has led the ideological way, most obviously for National and ACT, although it's worth noting that practically all of the movers and shakers behind Rogernomics spent time at American universities, mostly Duke University. Should John Key's government win a third term in 2014, the New Zealand trade union movement should prepare itself for an onslaught very similar to that which the organised workers of Wisconsin and Michigan, Ontario and British Columbia have over the best part of a decade been forced to endure. The future of the union movement, the era of globalised market liberal economy, we could sum it up in a single word: bleak. Karl Marx cautioned the readers of the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon that men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. Too many people focus on the second part of Marx's oft-quoted pronouncement. We should never forget, however, his opening assertion that it is indisputably human beings who drive their own history forward. The destruction of trade unionism in New Zealand is not something that has happened. It is something that might happen. If unionists like yourselves decide to bend the arc of history in the direction of social justice, then not only will trade unionism in New Zealand survive, it will flourish. Progressive change is always possible, but only if a sufficiently large number of people believe it to be possible. Aye, there's the rub. Because after what I have experienced and witnessed over the past decade, I am not at all convinced that New Zealand's trade union leaders really do believe that progressive change is possible. That is certainly the case if one defines progressive change as a decisive policy shift away from the presuppositions and assumptions of neoliberalism. Take, for example, the current 22-year-old experiment in voluntary union membership. This has seen union density in New Zealand fall from 55 to 22%, with, as I've already noted, only 1 in 10 private sector workers belonging to a trade union. The National Party's decision to abolish universal union membership in 1991 turned back the clock to 1936. And the destruction of the national award system returned New Zealand to the situation prior to the introduction of the Industrial Conciliation and Arbitration Act in 1894. What I find fascinating, however, is how few people, even on the left, dismiss the politicians responsible for these reforms, or even the business leaders and the think tanks advising them, as dinosaurs. But you just try suggesting to senior union officials that in the light of the damage inflicted on working class New Zealanders by so-called voluntary unionism, the time has come for the labour movement to champion a return to universal union membership and a national award system. Let me assure you, the only debate arising from your suggestion will be whether its author is a Brontosaurus, a Stegosaurus, or a Tyrannosaurus Rex. I know from personal experience that anyone advocating the dismantling of neoliberalism's key legislative achievements, of which labour market flexibility, as they call it, is among the most important, will almost immediately be accused of living in the past, as if neoliberalism is not preeminently a conscious attempt on the part of the capitalist ruling class to reconstitute the economic, social and political conditions prevailing in the early part of the 19th century. It is precisely this general inability to think outside the box of what you have called market liberal economics that prompts me to call it neoliberal totalitarianism. When you find that even those in charge of the organisations most likely to benefit from neoliberalism's demise cannot imagine a world that is not enthralled to free market precepts, that is when the future of unions, progressive NGOs and left-wing political parties seems at its bleakest. As the sun went down on election eve in 1938, 70,000 Auckland workers marched behind their union banners to the Auckland Domain. They gathered there in a deliberate show of strength to tell the people who had just 3 short years before treated them like cattle that they had become something else, that they were now free men and women who had taken charge of their country's destiny. The next day, they would deliver to Mickey Savage's Labour Party the most decisive electoral mandate in New Zealand's political history. The welfare state came into being because people were convinced that a better world was possible and that together they possessed the strength to build it. The future of the union movement in the era of a globalised market liberal economy will be made out of the building materials people like yourselves bring to its construction. If you believe that history is over and that neoliberal capitalism is as good as it gets, then trade unions will go the way of the medieval guilds. If you believe that human beings are still capable of making their own history and controlling their own destiny, then maybe you will bring to birth a new world from the ashes of the old, as the time-honoured union ballad Solidarity Forever promises. Because you know, the old song is right. The union does make us strong.